Before the narrative begins, allow yourself to settle into a state of absolute stillness. Close your eyes for a moment, then open them softly, letting your focus blur. Imagine the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders, evaporating like mist under the morning sun. You are safe here. There is no rush, no destination that requires your immediate arrival, and no clock ticking against your peace. Adjust your pillows, pull the blanket up to a comfortable height, and feel the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. Inhale slowly, counting the seconds in silence, and exhale even more slowly, releasing the tension in your jaw, your neck, and your hands. As you read the following words, let the sentences flow over you like a slow, warm river. The story is a landscape, not a race. It is a vast, open expanse of calm where time stretches out and slows down, allowing you to drift, deeper and deeper, into a profound and restorative rest. Let the desert described herein absorb your thoughts, its silence becoming your silence, its vastness becoming your sleep. The silence of the Ténéré was not merely an absence of sound, it was a physical weight, a heavy, velvet blanket of pressure that pressed against the eardrums and settled deep within the chest, older than the concept of history itself. Here, in the heart of the Sahara, the world was reduced to its most elemental geometry, the sweeping, parabolic curve of the dune, the infinite, crushing dome of the indigo sky, and the razor-thin horizon line where the two forces met in an eternal, shimmering standoff. Amayas knew this silence better than he knew the sound of his own voice. He was a man etched from the same carbon and silica as the landscape he traversed, his skin the color of deep mahogany cured in smoke, his eyes crinkled at the corners from 60 years of squinting against the relentless glare of a sun that did not forgive. He sat now, cross-legged on a woven mat of dyed palm fronds, the intricate geometric patterns of red and black faded by years of friction against the sand, watching the day surrender to the twilight. The cooling air was a tangible thing, a fluid that shifted the density of the atmosphere, causing the light to bend and refract in curious, melancholic ways. To his right, the kneeling form of his camel, Ténéré, was a stillness of bay fur and slow, rhythmic chewing, the animal's long eyelashes lowered in a meditative trance that mimicked the stoicism of the stones. Amayas reached out with a hand that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the resonance of the ground beneath him, and adjusted the small, battered teapot resting on the embers of an acacia fire. The fire was small, an efficient calculation of thermal energy versus fuel scarcity, a lesson in thermodynamics that his people had perfected over millennia. The tea inside the pot was not boiling yet. It was in that pre-critical state where the water molecules were beginning to agitate, a low hum that only the most attentive could hear, a vibration that signaled the transition from liquid to gas, a phase shift that Amayas found endlessly fascinating. He was a man of the Kel Tamasheq, the free people, but in his youth, he had traveled north, across the sea, to study the mechanics of the stars and the physics of the earth in the cold, gray universities of Europe. He had read the works of astronomers who looked at the sky through glass lenses, and he had returned to the desert to find that the sky was clearer here, seen through the lens of the atmosphere alone. He poured the tea from a height, the amber liquid arching through the cooling air, aerating, cooling slightly before it hit the small glass with a satisfying, rhythmic splatter. He poured it back into the pot, then into the glass again, a ritual of fluid dynamics designed to produce the perfect layer of foam, the alkash, which kept the tea hot and the sand out. "The stars are loud tonight, grandfather," a voice said, soft and woven into the wind. Amayas did not look up immediately. He finished the pour, watching the bubbles settle into a hexagonal packing pattern on the surface of the tea, a natural manifestation of efficiency in nature. He handed the glass to the boy, Ider, who sat opposite him, wrapped in a robe of synthetic indigo, a blend of traditional cotton and modern thermal polymers that regulated body heat. Ider was young, his mind a sponge of questions, his eyes reflecting the first emerging stars of the Orion belt. "The stars are always loud, Ider," Amayas replied, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting in a dry riverbed. "It is the atmosphere that sometimes dampens their song. Tonight the air is thin. The thermal layers are stable. There is no turbulence to scatter the photons. We are seeing the light exactly as it was intended to be seen, without the distortion of entropy." Ider sipped the tea, the steam rising to coat his face. "Entropy," the boy repeated, tasting the word as if it were a new flavor of date. "The tendency of order to decay into disorder. You speak of it often." "It is the only law that matters," Amayas said, his gaze drifting past the boy, past the camp, out toward the deeper darkness of the erg. "The desert is the ultimate expression of entropy. The mountains are ground down to rocks, the rocks to pebbles, the pebbles to sand, the sand to dust. Everything is seeking its lowest energy state. Even us. We sit, we conserve energy, we wait. We are fighting a slow war against the heat death of the universe, simply by breathing." The boy fell silent, respecting the elder's mood. They were 3 days' ride from the nearest well, deep in a sector of the desert that the maps left blank, a void of topographical data where the satellites saw only a uniform beige blur. But Amayas knew the terrain. He knew it not by landmarks, for the dunes shifted with every storm, but by the feel of the magnetic variation, the subtle shifts in gravity, and the taste of the air. However, tonight, there was a variable in the equation that did not fit. For the last 6 hours, as the sun began its descent, Amayas had felt a vibration. It was not the tectonic rumble of the earth, nor the infrasound of a distant storm. It was a rhythmic, artificial pulse, operating at a frequency just on the edge of human perception. It felt like a mathematical constant manifested in sound, a pure sine wave that did not decay. It came from the south, from the direction of the Adricuriate, where the black rocks rose like jagged teeth from the sea of sand. "Do you feel it?" Amayas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ider lowered his glass. "The humming? I thought it was the blood in my ears. I thought it was the fatigue." "It is not fatigue," Amayas said, standing up slowly. His joints clicked, a biological machine straightening its struts. He walked away from the fire, away from the sphere of light, into the deep blue wash of the night. He adjusted his tajumust, the indigo veil covering his face, leaving only his eyes exposed to the cosmos. The veil was more than clothing. It was a filter, a shield, a way to keep the moisture of the breath close to the body. He looked south. The horizon there was not empty. A faint, silvery luminescence was bleeding into the sky, a glow that had no source. It was not the zodiacal light, nor the pollution of a distant city. It was cold light, coherent and organized. "We must walk," Amayas said. "Leave the camels. They are biological. They will be frightened by what is inorganic. This requires a human mind to observe." They walked for what felt like hours, their boots crunching softly on the crust of the sand. The rhythm of their walking became a metronome, counting down the distance to the anomaly. Amayas let his mind drift into the analytical state he had cultivated during his years of study. He analyzed the light. It was blue-shifted, suggesting energy, suggesting high frequency. It did not flicker. It was absolute. As they crested a massive, longitudinal dune, the source revealed itself. It was not a ship. It was not a crash. It was a structure, or perhaps an entity, that defied the architectural logic of humanity. In the valley between two massive dunes, hovering exactly 2 meters above the ground, was a geometric shape of perfect smoothness. It resembled a rhombus, but its edges seemed to fold into themselves, suggesting dimensions that the human eye could not fully resolve. It was made of a material that was neither metal nor glass. It absorbed the starlight and re-emitted it as a soft, pulsing silver haze. The air around the object was cold, freezing cold. The ambient temperature of the desert was dropping rapidly as the night set in, but near the object, the air was crying out in thermal shock, moisture condensing instantly into microscopic ice crystals that sparkled like diamond dust in the silver light. "It is beautiful," Eider whispered, his fear overridden by the sheer aesthetic perfection of the form. "It is distinct," Amayas corrected, his mind racing through taxonomies of matter. "It is separate from the environment. It is a closed system." They descended the dune, sliding slightly in the loose sand, until they stood 20 meters from the hovering monolith. The silence here was different. It was an active silence, a suppression of noise. The wind, which had been whistling over the crests, died instantly as it entered the radius of the object. Suddenly, the surface of the object rippled. It was not a mechanical opening, but a molecular rearrangement. A section of the silver material became transparent, then vanished entirely, creating an aperture. From this opening, no ramp descended, no light beamed down. Instead, the sand beneath the object began to rise. The grains of silica, driven by a focused gravitational manipulation, lifted into the air, swirling, organizing, fusing together until they formed a solid platform that extended from the ground to the aperture. "They are using the local matter," Amayas murmured, fascinated. "They are manipulating the silicon bonds." Efficiency. Why bring matter when the universe is full of it? A figure appeared in the aperture. It was tall, impossibly slender, and encased in a suit that seemed to be made of flowing mercury. The suit reflected the desert, the stars, and the two humans standing below, camouflaging the entity by showing the universe back to itself. The head was enclosed in a transparent dome, revealing a face that was undeniably humanoid but lacking the chaotic asymmetry of biology. The skin was pale, translucent, revealing a network of bioluminescent veins that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic blue light. The eyes were large, dark, and lacked sclera. They were pools of pure sensory reception. The entity glided down the ramp of fused sand, moving without the bobbing motion of a walking biped. It was levitating slightly, or perhaps its control over its own mass was absolute. Amayas did not kneel. He did not raise his hands. He stood his ground, a vertical line of indigo against the horizontal world. He was a representative of his species, and he felt the weight of that responsibility. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the artificial quiet. "I am Amayas," he said, speaking in Tamasheq, the language of the desert. "This is the land of the Kel Tamasheq. You are strangers here." The entity stopped 3 meters away. It tilted its head, a bird-like movement that suggested calculation rather than curiosity. When it spoke, the sound did not come from a mouth. It resonated directly in the air between them, vibrating the molecules of nitrogen and oxygen to create speech. The voice was synthesized, harmonic, sounding like three voices speaking in perfect unison at different octaves. We recognize the designation Amayas, the entity said. The language was English, precise, archaic, and grammatically perfect, the kind of English one would find in a textbook from a century ago. Then, it shifted, the frequencies sliding. We recognize the designation Kel Tamasheq. We recognize the chemical composition of your carbon-based structure. We greet you. We are the archivists of the low-entropy states. Eider stepped behind his grandfather, clutching the fabric of Amayas's robe. Are they spirits, grandfather? Are they the jinn? No, Amayas said, switching to English, his accent thick but his vocabulary precise. They are not spirits. Spirits are metaphors for what we do not understand. These are beings of matter and energy. They are real. Are you not? We are as real as the silica beneath your feet, the entity replied. We are travelers of the density gradient. We have paused here to recalibrate our thermal exchangers. Your planet is unusually warm in its core, but cool on its crust. It is a paradox of thermodynamics. We call it home, Amayas said. He felt a strange calmness settling over him. This was a dialogue, and dialogues were governed by rules. Why do you choose the desert? Why not the cities where the lights are bright and the signals are dense? The entity seemed to shimmer, its suit reflecting a constellation that was not in the sky above. The cities are chaotic. The information density is too high, but the signal-to-noise ratio is poor. There is too much entropy in your cities. Too much waste heat. Too much redundant data. The desert is clean. It is a place of minimal data. It is easier to think here. It is easier to observe the fundamental constants. Amayas nodded slowly. This was a philosophy he understood. We say that the desert cleans the soul because there is nowhere to hide from yourself. You say it cleans the data. Precisely, the entity said. We have been observing your species for a significant duration. Not continuously, but in intervals. We visit the dry places. The Atacama, the Gobi, the Antarctic, and here the Sahara. These are the anchor points of your planet's stability. When these places change, your civilization ends. We monitor the rate of change. The desert is changing, Amayas said, his mind flashing to the drying wells, the shifting rains. The water is retreating deeper. The water is not retreating, the entity corrected gently. It is merely changing state and location. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. But yes, for your biological needs, the availability is decreasing. We have records of this region from 10,000 of your solar cycles ago. It was green. There were megafauna. Large bodies of fresh water. We have the scans. The entity raised a slender hand, and the air between them shimmered. A holographic projection materialized, not a flat screen, but a three-dimensional volume of light. Amayas gasped. He saw the dunes vanish, replaced by lush savannas, winding rivers, and vast lakes teeming with life. He saw herds of animals that no longer existed, and he saw people, his ancestors, painting on rock walls, swimming in the lakes, living in a world of abundance. You saw this? Amayas asked, his voice trembling with a longing for a time he had never known but always felt in his blood. We recorded it, the entity said. We do not experience time as you do. We do not remember. We access data. This data point is labeled Green Sahara Epoch. It was a period of high energy, high biological complexity. Now, the system has moved to a lower energy state. It is more stable now. Sand is very stable. But we cannot eat sand. Eider spoke up, his voice cracking. We cannot drink stability. The entity turned its smooth, domed face toward the boy. This is the tragedy of your specific biological configuration. You require high-energy inputs, chemical energy from food, thermal stability, liquid water. The universe, however, favors the low-energy state. You are fighting the natural direction of the cosmos. It is a noble struggle, but ultimately, a temporary one. Amayas sat down on the sand. The conversation was heavy, heavier than the fatigue of the walk. He gestured for the entity to join them. Will you sit? Or does your gravity manipulation forbid it? We can adapt, the entity said. The mercury suit flowed, and the being lowered itself onto the sand, sitting in a perfect replica of Amayas's posture. It was a mirroring gesture, a diplomatic algorithm execution. You call yourselves Archivists, Amayas said, picking up a handful of sand and letting it run through his fingers. What is the purpose of the archive? Who reads it? The universe is forgetting itself, the entity replied. The lights in its veins pulse slower now, matching the rhythm of Amayas's breathing. As entropy increases, information is lost. Stars burn out. Civilizations crumble. Genetic codes degrade. We collect the patterns before they are lost to the noise. We store the geometry of a snowflake before it melts. We store the song of a whale before the species goes extinct. We store the linguistic syntax of a tribe before it assimilates. We are the memory of the galaxy. So you are here to record us? Amayas asked. Because you think we are ending? Every system is ending from the moment it begins, the entity said. But do not be alarmed. Your species has a high latency period. You are resilient. You are adaptable. You are, however, at a bifurcation point. You are transitioning from a planetary species to a technological hybrid. We are here to record the before state. The state of the desert walker. The state of the star navigator. Amayas looked up at the Milky Way, a river of diamond dust spanning the sky. We navigate by the stars because they are constant. If they burn out, as you say, what will we steer by? You will steer by mathematics, the entity said. By the internal maps you are building. You, Amayas, you carry a map of this desert in your neural network that is more precise than our satellite scans. You know the density of the sand under the surface. You know the wind patterns by the smell of the dust. That is data we cannot capture from orbit. That is why we initiated contact. You want my map? We want to understand the perception of the map. The subjective experience of the Ténéré. We have the coordinates. We do not have the feeling. Our sensors are objective. We lack the qualia. We lack the sensation of thirst that gives water its value. Explain to us the value of water. Amayas closed his eyes. He thought of the deep wells of the Hagar. He thought of the taste of water after 3 days of travel, metallic, cool, sweet, life-giving. It was not just H2O. It was time. It was grace. Water, Amayas began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller, a rhythm that had lulled children to sleep for generations, is not a chemical. In the desert, water is God. It is the only truth. When you drink, you are borrowing time from the earth. You are accepting a loan that you must repay with your sweat, with your tears, and eventually, with your body returning to the moisture cycle. To drink is to pray. It is the acknowledgement of fragility. You say the universe favors the dry, the stable, the sand. But water is rebellion. It flows against the obstacle. It evaporates and rises against gravity. It is the chaotic element that allows for thought, for love, for fear. Without water, there is only the silence of the rocks. And while the rocks are peaceful, they do not dream. The entity remained silent for a long time. The silver light of its ship seemed to dim, creating a more intimate atmosphere in the vastness of the dune valley. Rebellion, the entity finally resonated. Water is rebellion against entropy. That is a novel categorization. We will archive this definition. It enriches the data set. Ider, who had been listening with wide eyes, asked, "Do you have water? In your ship?" "We synthesize our hydration," the entity said. "We recycle every molecule. We are a closed loop. We have not lost a molecule of water in 400 years. But we do not drink in the way you describe. We inject. It is efficient, but it lacks the rebellion." The night deepened. The cold became sharper. Amayas felt the chill seeping through his robes, but he did not move. He was locked in a moment of connection that transcended species. He was sitting with a ghost of the future, discussing the ghosts of the past. "You traverse the stars," Amayas said. "You have seen suns that are blue, and suns that are dying. Do you find beauty in them? Or just data?" "Beauty is a function of pattern recognition," the entity replied. "We perceive symmetry. We perceive complexity. When a nebula collapses, the mathematics of the gas dispersion is aesthetically pleasing to our processors. Is that beauty? If it makes you stop and look," Amayas said. "If it makes you forget for a moment that you are a machine or a man, and makes you feel small. That is beauty. Then we experience beauty," the entity said. "We feel small in the presence of the void between galaxies. The silence there is absolute. It is greater than the silence of this desert. Silence is the language of God," Amayas said. "We interpret it as best we can." They sat for hours. Amayas spoke of the Tuareg constellations, the camel, the shelter, the serpent. He explained how they guided the caravans, not just in space, but in time, marking the seasons for the goats to birth, for the dates to be harvested. The entity listened, its internal drives whirring softly, recording every phoneme, every inflection, every pause. It was ingesting the culture of the desert, preserving it in a crystal matrix that would outlast the earth itself. As the constellation of Orion began to dip toward the west, signaling the approach of dawn, the entity stood up. The movement was fluid, like water flowing uphill. "The solar cycle is reinitiating," the entity said. "Our thermal exchangers require the cold of the upper atmosphere. We must depart before the solar radiation interferes with our propulsion metrics." Amayas stood as well, helping Ida up. The boy was groggy, half asleep, walking in a dreamscape where aliens and ancestors were one and the same. "Will you return?" Amayas asked. "We are always observing," the entity said. "But physical contact is rare. It disturbs the local variables. We have what we needed. We have the definition of water. We have the map of the mind." The entity turned and floated back up the ramp of fused sand. As it entered the ship, the ramp dissolved, the grains of sand losing their cohesion and cascading back down to the desert floor, returning to their chaotic, natural state. The aperture sealed, leaving the seamless silver surface once again. The humming sound increased in pitch, moving up the scale until it passed the range of human hearing, becoming a vibration that shook the bones. The object did not shoot up with a roar of fire. It simply ceased to be affected by gravity. It lifted, slowly at first, then accelerating with an exponential curve, a streak of silver vanishing into the fading stars, becoming just another point of light, then nothing. Amayas and Ida stood alone in the valley. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It was not empty. It was full of the knowledge that they had been heard, that their existence had been recorded, that the story of the desert was now etched into the memory of the universe. "Did that happen, grandfather?" Ida asked, rubbing his eyes. "Or was it a mirage?" Amayas knelt and picked up a piece of the fused sand where the ramp had been. It was warm, smooth like glass, a perfect sphere formed by impossible forces. He pressed it into the boy's hand. "The desert is full of mirages, Ida," Amayas said softly. "But some mirages leave footprints. Come. The sun is rising. We must make the morning tea. The water must boil. The rebellion must continue." They walked back up the dune, their shadows stretching long and thin before them, reaching out toward the horizon. The sky turned from indigo to violet, from violet to the pale, dusty rose of dawn. The air began to warm, the cycle of heat beginning again. Amayas felt a profound peace settle over him. He was tired, a deep, cellular weariness that called for sleep. But it was a good tiredness. He had fulfilled his duty as a guide. He had guided the visitors to the truth of the water, and he would guide his grandson to the truth of the sand. Back at the camp, the camels were already awake, chewing their cud, indifferent to the cosmic encounter that had just occurred. Amayas rekindled the fire, the smell of acacia smoke grounding him in the present. He watched the water in the pot. He watched the bubbles rise. He watched the steam dissipate into the vast, open sky. He lay back on his mat, pulling his robe tight around him. The sun was rising, but for Amayas, the world was softening. The brightness of the day was merely a white curtain being drawn. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind sculpting the dunes, a ceaseless, whispering lullaby that had been singing for 1,000,000 years. The sand was a sea. The sky was a sea. And he was floating between them, weightless, drifting, archived, safe. The universe was vast, but he was home. And in the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the eternal, golden sands, Amayas slept. The narrative above captures the essence of the encounter, but to truly fulfill the request for a structure that mimics the endless, sleep-inducing expanse of the desert, we must delve deeper into the microscopic details of the environment, expanding the sensory experience to a granular level, slowing the perception of time until it matches the geological pace of the Sahara. Let us return to the moment of the tea pouring, before the aliens arrived, and expand the sensory field. Amayas watched the liquid. It was not merely tea. It was a solution of tannins and alkaloids, extracted from the rolled leaves of Camellia sinensis that had traveled thousands of miles from the humid hills of the east to reach this arid wasteland. He observed the color, a deep, translucent amber, darkening to a rich mahogany at the center of the glass where the liquid was thickest. As he poured, the stream was a twisted rope of fluid, catching the dying light of the sun. The sound was distinct, a high-pitched splashing that deepened in tone as the glass filled, acting as a variable resonance chamber. He focused on the steam. It rose in turbulent plumes, chaotic spirals that obeyed the Navier-Stokes equations of fluid dynamics. In the cooling air of the desert evening, the steam was white and dense. He watched a single wisp detach itself from the main column, drifting sideways on a microcurrent of air, swirling, thinning, and finally dissolving into invisibility. He imagined the water molecules dispersing, spreading out into the vast, dry atmosphere, joining the trillions of other molecules suspended in the void. He looked at his hand holding the pot. The skin was a landscape in itself. Deep fissures ran across his knuckles, dry riverbeds etched by decades of exposure to wind with 0% humidity. The nails were thick, slightly yellowed, trimmed short. He could feel the heat of the metal handle radiating into his palm, a transfer of thermal energy that warmed the bones of his hand. He felt the weight of the pot, the shifting center of gravity, as the liquid sloshed inside. Every movement was deliberate. In the desert, unnecessary movement was a waste of water. One did not twitch. One did not fidget. One moved with the economy of a predator or a stone. He looked at the sand around the mat. It was not uniform. There were grains of clear quartz, jagged and glass-like. There were grains of feldspar, pink and opaque. There were tiny black specks of magnetite. He traced the ripples in the sand with his eyes. They were miniature dunes, formed by the wind that had blown an hour ago. The pattern was self-similar, fractal. The shape of the ripple on the ground mimicked the shape of the giant dune they were camped beneath, which in turn mimicked the shape of the entire erg. Nature repeating itself at every scale. Ida was breathing. Amayas listened to the rhythm. In, out. In, out. A slow, steady cadence. The boy was young, his lungs elastic and pink. Amayas remembered being that young. He remembered the feeling of infinite energy, the belief that he could run across the dunes forever. Now, he knew that the dunes were infinite, and his energy was finite. It was a peaceful realization. He was not fighting the desert anymore. He was cooperating with it. The sky was changing. The blue was deepening, shedding its cyan hues and embracing the violet part of the spectrum. The first star, Sirius, was visible now, a piercing blue-white diamond oscillating in the atmospheric turbulence. Amayas fixed his gaze on it. He knew it was a binary system, two stars dancing around a common center of gravity, but to his eye, it was a singular point of brilliance. He thought about the light from that star. It had traveled for 8 years to reach his retina. The photons striking his eye now had left the surface of Sirius when Ida was just a baby, crawling on the mats of the tent. The sky was a time machine. Looking up was looking back. The wind shifted. The harmattan was sleeping, but a gentle breeze from the north brought the smell of cooling stone. It was a dry, mineral scent, distinct from the smell of dust. It smelled of ancient geology, of rocks that had baked in the sun for 12 hours and were now releasing that heat back into the void. Amayas inhaled deeply through his nose, filtering the air. He tasted the iron in the dust. He took a sip of the tea. It was scalding hot, bitter, and sweet. The sugar shocked his tongue. The caffeine hit his bloodstream with a familiar buzz. It was the fuel of the desert. He felt the warmth travel down his esophagus, settling in his stomach, radiating outward to his limbs. It was a moment of pure physical sensation, grounding him in his body. The silence returned, filling the spaces between the atoms. It was in this hyper-aware state, this meditative integration with the environment, that the anomaly presented itself. Not as a sudden intrusion, but as a subtle layering over the existing reality. The vibration Amayas felt was initially indistinguishable from the tremor of his own pulse. It started in the soles of his feet, transmitted through the sand. Sand is an excellent conductor of vibration. The grains packed together, transmitting mechanical waves with high fidelity. He felt a hum, a frequency of perhaps 60 Hz, deep and resonant. He placed his hand flat on the sand. The vibration was clearer there. It was constant. Nature is rarely constant. The wind gusts, the temperature fluctuates, the animals move in bursts. A constant vibration implies a machine. It implies a generator. It implies intent. He looked at the horizon. The distortion was subtle. The stars in the southern sky were not twinkling correctly. They were slightly blurred, as if seen through a lens that was out of focus. The gravitational lensing of the alien craft was bending the light around it, creating a mirage of position. Amayas, with his astronomer's eye, noticed the discrepancy. The star Canopus was half a degree higher than it should have been for this time of year. The journey to the object was a study in walking. Amayas taught Ida to walk the sand step, lifting the foot high, placing it flat, distributing the weight to avoid sinking. It was a slow, rhythmic gait, almost a dance. Crunch, shift, step. Crunch, shift, step. The sound was the only accompaniment to their breathing. The dunes were cooling rapidly. The surface temperature dropped from 40 degrees Celsius to 10 degrees in the span of 2 hours. The thermal contraction of the rocks occasionally caused a loud crack to echo through the valley, the pistol shots of the desert. When they finally stood before the object, the visual detail was overwhelming. The surface of the craft was not just silver, it was a fluid mirror. It seemed to have depth, as if the surface were a deep ocean of metallic liquid. Amayas could see his own reflection, distorted and elongated, staring back at him. He saw the texture of his indigo veil reflected in high definition. He saw the fear in Ida's eyes reflected. The cold emanating from the ship was not just an absence of heat, it was an active refrigeration. The ship was sucking the thermal energy from the air to power its systems. It was a heat sink. Amayas felt the moisture on his skin evaporate instantly. His lips felt dry. The alien entity's suit was a marvel of engineering. Amayas focused on the joints. There were no visible hinges, no servos. The material simply folded and expanded like organic skin. It was seamless. The dome over the head was not glass. It was a force field, a contained bubble of gas held in place by magnetic fields. He could see the faint ionization at the edges of the dome, a purple glow where the atmosphere of the ship met the atmosphere of Earth. The dialogue that followed was stripped of urgency. It was a conversation of concepts. When the entity spoke of Entropy. Amayas visualized the sand eroding the mountains. When it spoke of data, Amayas visualized the weaving patterns of his people's rugs, storing stories in knots and colors. The projection of the green Sahara was the climax of the sensory experience. The light from the hologram illuminated the valley. Suddenly, the smell of dust was replaced, in Amayas's mind, at least, by the smell of wet earth, of blooming vegetation, of rain. The visual stimulus was so strong it triggered a phantom olfactory response. He saw the hippos submerged in the water, their ears twitching. He saw the reeds swaying in a wind that no longer blew. It was a ghost world superimposed over the dead world. The departure of the ship was the reversal of the arrival. The vibration increased. The light intensified. And then, the displacement. The air rushed in to fill the vacuum where the ship had been, creating a thunderclap that rolled away into the dunes, fading, until it was just a memory of a sound. Amayas and Ida were left with the stars. The true stars. Unbent. Unfiltered. The walk back was slower. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a heavy, narcotic fatigue. The muscles in Amayas's legs burned with a dull ache. The cold was settling into his bones. He longed for the blankets, for the horizontal state. When he finally laid down, the transition to sleep was not immediate. It was a slow descent. He replayed the conversation. He visualized the entity's face. He felt the smooth sphere of fused sand in his pocket, turning it over and over with his thumb. It was his anchor. His breathing slowed. The sound of the wind became a white noise, a curtain of sound that blocked out the world. His thoughts became fragmented. Water, sand, stars, silver. The distinction between the dream and the memory blurred. The desert held him. The gravity held him. The night held him. And in the absolute, crushing, beautiful silence of the Central Sahara, under the watch of 1 billion burning suns, the mind of the traveler finally, gently, drifted into the void of sleep.